I want to clarify a few things about past theory. Where did it come from? I first started working with this theory actually in the late 70s, when I developed with the Kaufmans a lot of their KBC. And we read J.P.Das, who's pictured here with me, his book on simultaneous and successive cognitive processes, published in 1979. Some years later, JP and I met. This was our first meeting. We met in Tucson, Arizona, to begin to talk about how we would take a different approach to measuring intelligence or cognitive, and it would be based on the brain and cognitive processing. So we said, look, we know what the WISC measures, we know what IQ is, we're not going to be influenced by that. We're not going to be constrained by that. We're not going to do that anymore. We're going to start from scratch, and we're going to build a test based upon brain function. But where do we get information about brain function? We go to the literature, the neuropsychological literature, and we published in 1997 the first edition of the CAS. And then we published the second edition. And as you can see, we both got a little bit older. But JP is actually 19 years older than me, still going strong, still smart as ever. And we both are still, we're not giving up this mission because we think it really makes a difference in kids' lives. So what did we do? We built our test on a conceptualization of brain function that Luria described as 3 functional units. The first functional unit is for cortical arousal and attention. That's in the base of your brain. The second functional unit has two components: simultaneous processing for the back part of your brain. I've already talked about that. And successive processing, the temporal part of the brain. So you got brainstem, occipital-parietal, temporal, third functional unit, prefrontal, frontal lobes. So here's my theory of intelligence, whatever you want to call it. Here's my theory of learning. I really think PASS is a theory of learning. Actually, that's my favorite way of describing it. But here are the definitions of the 4 components. Planning is thinking about how you do, now listen to this part, what you decide to do. How you do what you decide to do. Attention is being alert and resisting distractions. Simultaneous processing is about getting the big picture, seeing how things go together. And successive processing is about following a sequence. Well, look what I just did. I described a sophisticated brain-based theory in the most ordinary terms. I don't need to use psychobabble or all kinds of weird, ways of describing this stuff. Because ultimately, we want to be able to explain it to, we explained it to our 8-year-old granddaughter when she was 7. We talked about it. I've seen my colleague Kathleen Griesa talk to kindergarten kids about their brains, talk about these things. So if you really want to help people who need some help, isn't the first step being able to really explain something to them? And I think it is. So the second thing that we decided when we built the CAS was we needed to measure how well the student thinks in a way that is not confounded by what they know. So how do you figure this out? It's really kind of simple. Let's say you're giving an arithmetic subtest, on a WISC or on a Stanford Binet or whatever, and the child didn't do very well. You can ask yourself these 2 questions. What did the student need to know to complete the task? Maybe it involved, addition of 2 two-digit numbers, and then you have to find out, has the child been taught that yet or not? And how does the student have to think to complete the task? Well, maybe the child needs to use a plan, or maybe the child needs to follow a sequence, and so on. So these are critical questions. If you answer the question, what does the student need to know to complete this task on an IQ test, and you say they have to know this, they have to know that, they have to know the other thing, then in my opinion, it's not an ability test. It's too confounded by knowledge. So let's talk a little bit about the P in planning, in the past theory. It's a term used to describe I like to call them neurocognitive functions. Because when we built the CAS, we really were merging cognitive psychology and neuropsychology. And these are similar. Planning is a similar concept to executive function, metacognition, those kinds of terms that you've worked with, we've dealt with for a long time. Frontal lobe, you know the story of Phineas Cage and all that jazz. So when we think about planning, what we're really talking about is when you have a goal, you make decisions about how you're going to achieve that goal. And you're really, in that case, predicting what's going to happen if you do something in one way or another, or what someone else might be doing. So it certainly involves impulse control, strategy. Sometimes it means I need more information to answer the question. So that's also a good plan. So this is the part that really helps us solve any kind of a problem. It's not just academics. We focus on academics, but it's not just that. It's social, emotional. It's work, life work. It's really everything. So how do you measure planning? Well, you give a student a relatively easy task, and you let them know that they can fill it out in any way that they want, as long as they follow the basic rules. So in this example, obviously you can figure out what the child has to do. Put XO under the A's and OO under the B's, and so on. And when we give them the blank page without any of the red marks on it, when I gave this to Jack Jr. at age 5, as I introduced the task and gave him the directions, the last part of direction says you can do it any way you want. Jack Jr. did the XOs for A's, then he did the OOs for the B's, and then he started the C column. Well, that's pretty clear. He looked at the task. He decided to do it in a way you could say it's easier. I would say it's more efficient. And he executed his plan and did really well. That's how you measure planning. You give kids a relatively easy task, and you kind of sit back and you say to them, you can figure out how to do it. So one of the things that we have with the CAS 2 is a rating scale for teachers. And the planning items on the rating scale have to do with things like, does the child evaluate his own actions? That's self-reflection, right? Does produce several ways of solving a problem? That's coming up with different strategies to different solutions. So just to see, this is kind of things we see in the classroom. But here's another thing that we might see in a classroom when we teach students about a doubles and near doubles rule in mathematics. This is a way of helping students arriving at an answer by thinking rather than by memorizing. Because when you say to the kid, what's 8 and 8, they say 16. Usually kids learn the doubles first. But then when you say, what's 8 and 9, they say, I don't know, right? And they say, well, 9 is just one more than 8. And you knew 8 and 8 was 16, so what would 8 and 9 be? Oh, yeah, 8 and 8 and 1, well, that's just 17. So what happens is now we're learning by thinking. We're learning the value of a strategy. And this is really beautiful. This was actually Jack Jr.'s work in elementary school, but the teacher just told him to take it home, fill it out, and bring it in tomorrow. Teacher didn't understand the value of this wonderful illustration. Anyway, that's the planning piece. Now, attention. Basic psychological process that we use to attend and resist. It's not just attending, it's also resisting. So it's focused cognitive activity, resistance to distraction, listening as opposed to just hearing. How can we measure it? The Stroop is a really good way of measuring, because when you look at this word here, you want to say red, but you have to say yellow. So what happens is the conflict is at the point of expression. That's why we call this expressive attention on the CAS 2. And the kind of behaviors that we see in the classroom, getting off task, listening carefully, having a good attention span, those kinds of things. But here's the interesting thing. Actually, this is Jack Jr.'s homework. I was checking it one night after dinner, and I glanced at the first problem and saw that Jack chose option D, and I said, Jack, the answer is A, 6:22. And Jack said to me, no, Dad, it's D, 6:22 p.m., not 6:22 a.m. And I thought, after dinner, too many glasses of Chianti. My attention was off. But here's the thing. You never want to give a test like this to a kid who has an inattentive type of ADHD, because their thinking problem will get in the way of how much you can find out about how much they know. See, these terms of thinking and knowing, they're really powerful and they have a lot of relevance. So this is a case that Tullio showed recently, very recently, of a young boy who has some strengths academically and some weaknesses academically, as you can see, and teacher concerns. And on the WISC for Spanish, he's a bilingual student, and Tullio assessed him in Spanish. You can see the scores there. But look what happened on the CAS. 105 in planning, 91 in simultaneous, 94 in successive, 79 in attention, like Alejandro in a lot of ways. So what did Tullio do? He did a simple intervention. He went to my Helping Children Learn book. He pulled out this little graphic, and he helped the teacher understand the value of teaching Jose that when he was stuck, he needed to look at the details. So they scotch taped this little image to his desk. And the day that we were talking about this, Tullio said, and I just got a message from the teacher today saying that Jose increased in his reading accuracy by 80%. He's reading more words correctly than he has. A simple intervention like that, scotch taping a message, a mantra to a student who had trouble attending to his desk. Wow, it made a difference. That's a really simple intervention. All right, let's talk about successive processing next, sequencing. This is temporal lobe, as I mentioned. Anything in order, anything. Speech articulation, recalling information in order, tying your shoes, remembering combination to your locker, reading to coding, word, letter, sound, correspondence. You know how oftentimes people say, oh, this student has dyslexia. And you say, well, how do you know that? Well, they did really poorly on the phonological tests. And so we're going to give them all kinds of phonological training. And I go, the only problem with that logic is phonological is a symptom. Successive processing is the cause. You have to deal with the successive processing weakness. It's not just that they don't know the phonics rules. They can't do the phonics stuff because it's all about sequencing. So I think, have been misled in a lot of ways to think, oh, phonological is, the problem with dyslexia. No, it's not. It's just a symptom. And it's really a problem. So how do we measure successive processing? We use word recall, like digits forwards kind of thing. We also do a visual digit span test. And we also do a really awesome syntax test. Because syntax is all about sequencing. So for the little kids, we say a statement like the red, green, the blue, the yellow. And this child has to say it back correctly, completely correctly, to get a pass on it. But for the older kids, we say the same sentence, but then we ask them a question. The red, green, the blue, with the yellow, who got greened? And the kids laugh and they think it's really a riot, But what we're really doing is we're getting at the syntax of a statement. That's what we're getting at the syntax of the statement. And to answer the question, You have to understand the sequence. So we could have said the girl hit the boy with a stick who got hurt. But once you say that, you can see it as a whole. And that would bring simultaneous processing into it. So you can tell we spent a lot of time developing these tasks, more than 10 years actually. We worked more than 10 years to refine and refine and refine these subtests to make sure they work the way they need to. So the rating scale has things like sound out hard words, remember how to spell, imitate long sequences of sounds, things that teachers might see in the classroom. So when my colleague Kathleen Kreese and I were doing our week-long seminar for the Learning in the Brain last year, there were some folks in the audience who had a case. This was a high school boy whose handwriting was atrocious, as you can see in this picture. And they asked me, well, how would you explain this from PASS? And I said, well, according to Luria, the foundation of handwriting would be successive processing. And they all of a sudden, there was a couple of these teachers, and they said, wait a second, we have here, on our computer, we have his PASS scores. Let's look them up. And I was thinking, oh man, I hope it comes out right, you know? Well, it sure did. Look at this, 90 in planning, 93 simultaneous, 103 attention, 55 on a successive processing scale. This is a young adult. This is a young adult with a learning disability that was never identified. This student, young adult, could have been identified in first grade if they tested him with the right test. They didn't. There's a lot of kids at that alternative high school like that. Young adults with undiagnosed learning disabilities. We know that because we gave the CAS2 brief to everybody. All right, simultaneous, getting the big picture. All right, so this is the whole, understanding how things fit together, seeing things as a whole, as a pattern. That's what simultaneous processing is all about. And this is a great simultaneous processing test. Take a look at this. Which picture shows a boy behind a girl? So what do you have to do? You have to understand this statement. We read it to the student, but it's printed on the bottom of the page if they can read it. And we can repeat it. The student needs to choose which picture shows a boy behind a girl, not a girl behind a boy, as in number 2. Right? So it's about interrelationships of, in this case, people. The harder items are things like which picture shows a square to the left of a triangle, below a cross to the right of a blah, blah, blah. You know, it gets really crazy. But it's all about interrelationships. And so we asked the teacher, well, does this student like to draw designs? You know, are they good at seeing how things go together, patterns? And good with visual materials, shapes. Those are the kinds of things we see. But now I'm gonna take you a little deeper here. So let's look at something at a different level. The item on the left, we have a matrices item on the CAS. And, you know, I've published my Naglieri nonverbal, which, as Suzanne mentioned, you know, is widely used for identification of gifted children. In the CAS, we put that within a simultaneous processing category. But let's look at that item for a second. You don't have to label it a white circle and a blue circle. You don't have to label it or use any words. You can look at it and decide what the answer should be, right? Answer should be, which one? Just put your hand up with how many fingers? Yes, number 1. Now, what kind of thinking is involved there? You have white circle becomes blue in the top. A white square becomes blue on the bottom. Like this. This is to this, as this is to this. This is to this. So it's this relationship here, right? Once you decide for that relationship, you know that's the answer. So now how about this? Girl is to woman as boy is to, obviously, man. Look at this. Girl is to woman as boy is to man. Same thinking, right? 3 is to 6 is 4 is to 8. Same thinking. Now, if anyone, is anyone in the audience today a musician and can answer the last one? Does anybody know? C7 is to F as E7 is to A. It's the same kind of thinking if you have the knowledge, right? So you know I've been a musician for more than 60 years. So this is more than second nature for me. I don't even think about it. I just play it, right? But if you don't have the knowledge, you can't answer the question. Same thing is true with information similarities, arithmetic vocabulary, the phonological tasks that are in the Woodcock-Johnson, and so on and so forth. That's why I'm so adamant. You cannot measure thinking unless you take the knowledge out of it. What we have with PASS is a common knowledge in plain English that you can explain to the most important person, the student you assess, and the people that work with that student. And if you have the luxury of working with that student, that's even better.